Max Verstappen's radio message after Hungary qualifying did not reveal frustration. It revealed an aerodynamic disaster inside Red Bull. After spinning at the final corner, Verstappen said the car was completely broken aerodynamically and getting worse and worse. He qualified sixth with a lap of 1 minute, 17.725 seconds, more than half a second behind Lando Norris on pole. But the spin was only the final symptom. Across 3 consecutive sessions, the rear of the RB22 became increasingly unstable. First, Verstappen said the car felt as though the handbrake was on. Then came rear locking under braking. By qualifying, the car was progressively losing rear downforce, forcing more oversteer with every lap. And this was not ordinary tire wear. Verstappen said the car itself was degrading. That means he was not simply fighting a difficult setup. He was fighting a machine that kept changing beneath him, until the final corner exposed the full scale of Red Bull's problem. Laurent Mekies tried to calm him over the radio. Verstappen called the situation a joke. And the most alarming detail is still unanswered. Red Bull confirmed the progressive aerodynamic loss, but the exact failed component was not identified. So sixth on the grid may not be the real disaster. The real disaster is that Verstappen may no longer know whether the rear of his car will behave the same way twice. Subscribe to the channel. To understand why that radio message matters so much, you have to separate ordinary frustration from a genuine loss of confidence in the car. Formula 1 drivers complain about balance all the time. Too much understeer. Too much oversteer. Not enough grip. Tires that refuse to switch on. Those problems are serious, but they are familiar. A driver can describe them, the engineers can compare the feedback with the data, and the team can begin adjusting the setup. What Verstappen described was different. He was not saying the car had one predictable weakness. He was saying the weakness was growing. Lap after lap, the rear of the Red Bull became harder to trust. The oversteer increased. The aerodynamic support faded. And the car that began qualifying was no longer behaving like the car he had beneath him at the end. That is the first major clue. Because a Formula 1 driver does not control the car through reaction alone. At those speeds, reaction is often too late. The driver has to predict what the car will do before it happens. He must know how much grip will remain when he releases the brake. He must know how quickly the rear will rotate. He must know whether the car will accept the throttle without stepping sideways. That confidence is built through repetition. One corner teaches the driver what to expect from the next. One lap creates the reference for the following lap. But in Hungary, Verstappen's references kept becoming unreliable. A braking point that worked earlier could suddenly feel dangerous. A steering input that produced a small slide on one lap could trigger a much larger movement on the next. And a corner that had seemed manageable could become the place where the car finally broke away. That is why the final corner spin cannot be treated as one isolated mistake. The limit itself was moving. Imagine walking across the same floor several times, but the surface becomes more slippery with every crossing. The first time, you notice almost nothing. The second time, your foot moves slightly. The third time, you shorten your steps. Then, without any obvious warning, the same movement that felt safe before sends you sliding. That is the kind of uncertainty Verstappen was fighting. And qualifying makes that uncertainty even more dangerous. There is no room to protect the car. No room to wait for the balance to improve. No room to drive several tenths below the limit and hope for a better opportunity later. The clock is running. The tires have a narrow performance window. The other drivers are improving. And the final lap may be the only chance left. So Verstappen had to attack a car he no longer fully trusted. That is the contradiction at the center of Red Bull's disaster. Qualifying demanded complete commitment. The car demanded caution. Verstappen could not satisfy both. And when he reached the final corner, the conflict finally became visible. The rear stepped away. The car rotated. The lap disappeared. Yellow flags came out. And the entire session changed in seconds. But the radio message revealed something the spin alone could not. Verstappen believed the problem had been building for much longer. He said the car was completely broken aerodynamically. Then he repeated that it was getting worse and worse. Those words point directly toward progressive aerodynamic loss, not one sudden moment of driver error. And Verstappen's own explanation made the distinction even sharper. When tires degrade, the driver expects the grip to fall. That is normal. Tires overheat. The rubber wears. Braking becomes more difficult. Cornering speed drops. The driver adapts. But Verstappen said the car itself was degrading. That means the problem was not simply the grip available from the tires. The aerodynamic behavior of the Red Bull was changing through the session. And that is far more alarming. Aerodynamics are what help a Formula 1 car stay pressed against the track. The wings, floor, and bodywork manage the air moving around the car, creating grip that allows the driver to corner at extraordinary speed. When the rear loses that support, the car becomes nervous. The front turns. The rear does not remain planted. And the car begins rotating more than the driver intended. A small amount can be controlled. A predictable amount can be managed. But progressive loss means the driver does not know how much support will remain on the next attempt. That removes the foundation of confidence. And once confidence disappears, the driver faces a brutal decision. Back off and accept a weaker result. Or continue pushing and risk losing the car completely. Verstappen chose to push. Not because he ignored the danger. Because qualifying gave him almost no alternative. He was already more than half a second away from Lando Norris on pole. He needed improvement. He needed every available fraction of time. Then, at the final corner, the rear could no longer give him what he needed. But here is what makes the situation even more serious for Red Bull. The warning did not begin in qualifying. It had been developing throughout the entire weekend. During the first practice session, Verstappen said the car felt as though he were driving with the handbrake on. That suggested the Red Bull was not moving or responding freely. The car felt restricted, as though something were holding it back. Then, during the second practice session, he reported rear locking under braking. Now the problem had moved from a general lack of performance into a direct stability issue. The rear was becoming difficult to control when he tried to slow the car. Then came qualifying. The rear aerodynamic grip deteriorated progressively. The oversteer became worse. And the final result was the spin. 3 sessions. 3 connected warnings. Each one more severe than the last. That pattern matters because it shows the qualifying incident did not appear from nowhere. Red Bull had already seen signs that the rear of the car was not behaving properly. First, it felt slow. Then unstable. Then almost impossible to trust. The exact failed component is not identified in the source. And that uncertainty may be Red Bull's biggest problem. If one part had visibly broken, the team could replace it. If one system had clearly failed, the engineers could isolate it. But progressive aerodynamic deterioration is harder to understand because the cause may not announce itself with one obvious break. The team must study why the airflow changed, why the rear support reduced, why the car became more nervous as the session continued, why the behavior became worse instead of more stable. That investigation takes more than one radio message. It takes data, car movement, ride height, steering input, brake traces, speed through the corners, and the relationship between everything the driver felt and everything the sensors recorded. But Verstappen did not have time to wait for that investigation. He was inside the car while the problem was still happening. That is why his words were so emotional. From the cockpit, it may have felt as though the car was giving him less with every lap, while the session continued demanding more. And when Laurent Mekies came onto the radio, his response showed that Red Bull understood how serious the moment had become. He told Verstappen that conditions were extremely difficult. He said the team knew what he was feeling. That was an attempt to calm him. But reassurance could not restore the lost rear grip. Acknowledging the problem could not repair the aerodynamic balance. And telling Verstappen that the team understood did not answer the question he needed answered most. Why was the car getting worse? That is where the tension truly begins. Verstappen was not asking for sympathy. He was demanding a car he could trust. Red Bull was trying to contain the emotion while still understanding the failure. And between those two needs sat a 6th-place qualifying result, a spin, and a championship situation that was already becoming more difficult. Because Verstappen entered Hungary 7th in the drivers' standings with 91 points. He was already chasing. Already under pressure. Already needing strong weekends. Starting 6th after an aerodynamic collapse does not simply make the race harder. It removes control. There will be more traffic. More dirty air. More strategic risk. More opportunities for the unstable rear to become a problem again. And this is the part that turns one qualifying disaster into a much larger threat. If the car became harder to control over a short session, what happens across a full race distance? The source does not confirm that the same deterioration will definitely return. But Red Bull cannot ignore the possibility. The race will bring changing fuel load, changing tires, changing temperatures, and repeated exposure to turbulent air from cars ahead. Every one of those conditions can place greater pressure on a car that is already struggling for rear stability. So Verstappen's radio message was not simply an emotional reaction to losing one lap. It was a warning. The car had changed. The rear had weakened. The problem had grown across the weekend. And Red Bull had reached the final part of qualifying without stopping it. That is why the spin matters. That is why the anger matters. And that is why 6th on the grid may only be the beginning of the damage. And this is where Verstappen's radio message begins to expose something even more serious. The spin was not only the result of lost rear grip. It was the result of a car that had stopped giving Verstappen reliable information. That difference matters. A difficult car can still be fast. A nervous car can still be controlled. But a car that changes from lap to lap forces the driver to question every input. How hard can he brake? How quickly can he turn? How much throttle can he use? Will the rear stay planted? Or will it suddenly rotate again? Those questions do not remain inside one corner. They follow the driver around the entire lap. And once doubt enters the cockpit, the driver begins losing time before the car even moves. A tiny hesitation on the brakes costs speed. A slightly slower steering input costs momentum. A cautious throttle application costs acceleration. One small uncertainty becomes another. Then another. By the end of the lap, the stopwatch shows a large gap, even when no single corner looks disastrous. That helps explain why Verstappen finished more than half a second behind Lando Norris. The gap was not necessarily created by one huge mistake. It could build through a sequence of small compromises, each one caused by the same underlying problem. Verstappen had to leave a little more margin. Then a little more. Until the final corner gave him none at all. But that is only half the story. The spin also damaged the drivers behind him. Kimi Antonelli was directly behind Verstappen when the yellow flags appeared. That placed Antonelli under investigation over whether he had reduced his speed enough in the danger zone. George Russell also had to lift off the accelerator as he passed the affected area. So Red Bull's aerodynamic problem did not stay inside the Red Bull garage. It changed the qualifying session for Mercedes as well. That is how quickly one failure can spread through Formula One. The rear loses grip. The car spins. The yellow flags appear. Other drivers lose their laps. An investigation begins. And suddenly, a technical problem inside one car becomes a major issue across the entire grid.